A European Team Championship was first held at Vienna in 1957. There were 4 teams competing. Then, as on all subsequent occasions, the championship was won by the Soviet Union. It was followed then by Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia and West Germany. In the booklet accompanying this cassette you will find details of that tournament and the ones which followed. As you can see, the championship was expanded to 6 teams in 1961 and finally to its present form of 8 teams at Katzenberg 1970. You may also notice that the first 3 places were always occupied by Eastern European teams. In January of this year, the European Team Championship final was held for the first time in Sweden, in fact in a little town called Skara. There were as usual 8 teams competing. In order to reach the finals, the various teams had to qualify from different groups. Only the defending champions, and as you may have guessed, these were as usual the Soviet Union, qualify automatically. This qualification is far from a simple process for some of the teams. In the booklet you can see how some of the teams reached the finals. We, the English in particular, had to narrowly win our group ahead of West Germany. In fact, this involved beating Wales by more than the West Germans did. But having qualified, we were one of perhaps 4 or 5 nearly equal teams. Of course, the Russians are by far the strongest, but of the rest, many over about the same strength, with perhaps a couple a little weaker. The Israelis also had a difficult task. They displaced the Dutch to reach Skara. In the booklet you will find full results of the event, so I'm not going to bore you by reiterating these. What I will say is that, of course, the Soviet Union won by a street, and I guess this was probably expected from the beginning, but after them there came 4 teams separated by only half a point each. Going to the last round, we, the English team, were half a point ahead of the Hungarians, and we had them to play. Unfortunately, we lost 5-3, but in the middle of the match it looked as though it might have been much worse. Jonathan Mestel lost uncharacteristically to Farrago, and no games seemed to be going in our favour. Previous to this match, England was unbeaten in the top 5 boards. Our team had won a large number of games, but in fact these were almost always black. Only Jonathan Mestel on board 7 had won games with white. But in the match against Hungary, unfortunately our record in the first 5 boards was spoilt. I'm afraid that I lost as black against Sachs, and I'll be showing you that game later, or an extract from that game, so I shan't continue to talk about that now. What I will say is that even though we lost to the Hungarians 5-3, we still came third, and at the beginning of the event we would have been delighted with coming third. As I said previously, no Western European team had ever won a medal before in a European Team Championships, and so this was really a pretty good result. Well, I've now blown the England team's trumpet quite enough, I think, so I think I'll start to show you some games and some game extracts. In the first round, England played the Soviet Union, and on board 1, Tony Miles was black against world champion Anatoly Karpov. He had never beaten him before, but in this game as black he caused quite a sensation really by winning. Moreover, on his first move he used a very unusual opening. After 1e4 he played a6 and followed up with b5. He got pressure on Karpov's centre and really quite an equal position. And Karpov, I think, was very off-put by the fact that Miles had played this rather silly opening. Well, this is certainly not a theoretical opening. And he played badly. He played very badly for a world champion and quite badly for anybody, and got a very bad ending and lost. Now, in the normal course of events, I would have been showing you this game, but I'm informed by Michael Basman that he is going to put this game on his forthcoming cassette on an opening which he is going to call the St. George defence. In Skara, the English team wanted to call it the Birmingham defence, since Tony Miles lives there, but Mr. Basman, who has certainly played it in weekend tournaments before, he feels that St. George defence is better, as in beating up dragons, and this isn't just a dragon variation, it's dragons in general. So that's strong chess players. So instead I'm going to start with what was in fact the first decisive game of the tournament. It was the game between Polugaevsky and Nunn. Polugaevsky has just qualified from the Riga Interzonal to play a candidates match with Tal, so he's an extremely strong grandmaster. But as white against Jon Nunn, he didn't do so well, as you will see. This game was a Benoni, a modern Benoni. d4, knight f6, d4, knight f6, knight f3, c5, d5, e6. White played c4, e takes d5, c takes d5, d6. So although this game didn't start with a normal Benoni move order, we've now transposed to a usual position in the modern Benoni. And the game continued very normally. Knight c3, g6, e4, bishop to g7, bishop to e2, castles, castles, rook to e8, knight to d2. This is all normal. White puts his bishop on e2 rather than d3 because, although it doesn't protect the e-pawn there, it is out of the way of a later advance by black c5 to c4, which would gain a tempo otherwise. And now he's defending his e-pawn with his knight. White wants to start by defending his e-pawn and then gradually prepare for a kingside advance. But he mustn't rush forward too quickly, or else black may get very strong tactical chances, as you will see. Knight b to d7, queen to c2, knight to e5. Polugaevsky played b3, and Nunn continued with knight to h5. Now, this move has been played in various positions in the modern Benoni, but maybe black should instead play g6 to g5 here. Although that weakens the king's position a little, it controls the important f4 square, and this may be very useful. And I'm told that in a Korchnoi-Mecking match, the candidates match some years ago, Mecking in fact played g5, and he reached a very good position, though he lost in the end. So, Nunn played knight h5, which is a bit dubious, and Polugaevsky took that. Bishop takes h5. Nunn recaptured. g6 takes h5. Polugaevsky continues with his plan, bishop to b2. Bishop to d7, rook a to e1, queen to h4. And this is the position of diagram 1, which as you can see. Now, Polugaevsky here should play some sort of quiet plan of moving his pieces round to control the king side. An appropriate move in this respect would be knight to d1, knight on c3 to d1, to be followed perhaps by knight e3, and then he can try to go into f5 sometime. He just wants to keep control. Instead, he decided to play rather a risky tactical move, and he knew he was sacrificing the exchange with this move, but he hadn't calculated the consequences accurately. He played f2 to f4, which must be considered dubious, I think. And Nunn played knight to g4, knight to f3, and, of course, bishop d4 check. If black's queen retreated, black would have a terrible game. But after bishop d4 check, he wins the exchange, because, of course, if knight takes the bishop on d4, then queen takes h2 is mate. So, king h1, knight to f2 is check, rook takes f2, queen takes f2, queen to c1. Now, clearly, both players had envisaged this position when f4 was played. None had envisaged this position before he played his move previous to that, which was queen to h4, and Polugaevsky had seen it when he played f4. And now Nunn played a tactical stroke, bishop to h3, a very good move. And this move, the point of this is to gain time and initiative. Black is the exchange up at the moment, but he's rather weak in the black squares because his bishop on d4 is emprise to the knight. He wouldn't lose anything if it got taken, but his controlled black squares would be considerably weakened. And he must play actively. If he starts going backwards, he'll just get squashed despite having slightly more material. Bishop h3 is a good move, because now if pawn takes the bishop on h3, then queen takes f3 would be mate. and so white's only sensible move is rook to g1. Now, this position Polugaevsky had foreseen, and he played up to here very quickly, I'm told. But after Nunn's next move, which is very excellent, he lapsed into thought as he realised that he didn't really have enough compensation for his material. Look at this position now, and see if you can find black's next move. It's not very spectacular, but it's very good. Okay, so black played king to f8 to get his king out of the way, and this is a really excellent move. If he'd moved his bishop, say to g4, then white would have regained the initiative, and he could have played rook to f1, for instance, after which black's pieces are being driven around. It's most unpleasant. So, instead, king to f8 keeps the momentum going, and white now played knight takes d4. He had a long think. C takes d4, and he played the interesting move f5. If he moved his knight, then a disaster would happen. For instance, if knight to d1, then black plays bishop takes g2 as check, a strong move. Rook takes g2, queen to f1 with check, or even queen to e1 with check actually is good, but queen to f1 with check. Rook to g1, queen to f3 with check, rook to g2, rook takes e4, and white's pieces are all squashed backwards. All the black pieces are very active. Black must be winning there. So, instead, white played the speculative f5, but this isn't really good enough, and the game continued. D takes c3, queen takes c3, and of course, black must continue to play actively, so he played rook takes e4. And now white played g takes h3. Now study this position again, this position, and see if you can find black's next move. And if you remember what he played last time I asked you to look for a move, and you may not find it so hard to find black's move. Well, black played king to e8, which is an excellent move, getting his king out of the way. White threatened various things, among them rook g8 check might be a nuisance, because if king takes g8, queen h8 or queen g7 will be mate. And moving the king away gets it into safety. Now, for instance, queen c7, which would threaten rook g8 mate, then black has simply queen f3 with check, rook g2, rook e1 mate. So white is very restricted in his movements. When you have a king which is going to be driven somewhere with tempo, it's sometimes a good idea to go there anyway. So if your opponent plays the move which would drive it there with tempo, it now doesn't have the forcing nature it had previously, and you can do something different. And king e8 is an excellent move. White played queen d3, in fact, while white is completely busted in this position. There is no play. And after rook e1, rook takes e1, queen takes e1 with check, king to g2, rook to c8, black was clearly winning, and the game concluded f6, king d7, queen takes h7, queen to d2 is check, king to g3, queen takes d5, king to h4, rook to e8, and Polugaevsky, who had not had much time for a long time, I mean, when a very strong grandmaster gets a bad position, he tries to think of a way to make it good, and in this case there just wasn't any chance. He resigned here with very little time left. So a very fine win for Jon Nunn. After his catastrophic loss in round 1, Karpov remained out of form for the rest of the tournament. The last time he played in the European Team Championship, and this was Moscow 1977, he scored 5 out of 5 and then retired, presumably unhurt. In this tournament he didn't do so well. He lost his game to Miles and then drew 4. He didn't win a game at all. Now, given that the event was in Skara in Sweden, there was of course great interest in the Swedes, and in particular in their broad one Ulf Andersson. When he was to play Karpov, and this was in round 3 in fact, there was an immense amount of interest, and there was a television crew, and I think there were radio interviews. So there was just a considerable amount of excitement about the man playing Karpov, especially as Karpov was known not to be playing at his best. And since I've told you Karpov's results, then you will know that this game was a draw. And I'm now going to show you it in its concluding stages. So if you please turn to diagram 2 and set up the position on your board. Now, this game started as a Scheveningen variation, and Karpov played G4. Anderson played H6, and what happens in this variation is that white gets a space advantage in the king side, but his pawns are split. After G4, H6, and don't really worry about what the position is there, then G5, H takes G5, bishop takes G5 happens, and white has got pawns in F2 and H2 against G7 and F7. Now, white can then, if he is energetic, exchange off his H pawn for the G pawn, but this of course reduces the amount of material on the board, reduces white's winning chances. In this game, this occurred, and black's red bishops came off as well, and eventually Anderson, who liked very compact positions, you can see all his pieces grouped in a 3x5 rectangle, almost all his pieces apart from the rook and F8. And he also played F5 and took on E4 to get the pawn structure you can see. Anderson is a little worse, and he's also in quite a lot of time trouble, because playing at Karpov is arduous, just because he's world champion, so people are frightened of making mistakes, because they're liable to be seized upon. Here, Karpov played his 36th move, knight to E2. And Anderson bashed out. I don't know if he bashed out, I'm sure he didn't, he's a very polite player, but he played quickly, knight to D5. Karpov played queen to G3, and Anderson played a move which looks like it wins material, queen to A5. Now, glancing at the demonstration board, I did a double take and thought, my God, has Karpov lost some more material again? But in fact, there is a reason why he hasn't. The threat is queen takes knight, and also knight to C3 is check. And there are actually two defences. Yes, king to C1 is a defence, I now observe, something like I hadn't noticed before. But white also has another, more active defence. See if you can find that now. Well, white played 37, F38, F5. And now if knight to C3 was checked, doesn't do anything, excuse me, because the line's blocked, the queen and the rook. The pawn has come between, and if queen takes knight, then queen takes D6 check, talks the king and the rook. St. Anderson was forced to play E5, after which is a little worse. Knight to C4, queen to C7, rook to H6, knight to F6, and that was Anderson's 40th move. They could settle down to contemplate whether his position had deteriorated during the time trouble, and in fact nothing too terrible has happened. And white played 41, knight to C3, queen to E7. And here Karpov sealed, and in fact I am told that the move he sealed isn't the best, and I'm not going to ask you to find which move is best, because it would require a great deal of work to find it out. In fact, he played knight to E3, but better was knight to B6, and presuming he has the additional possibility of taking the bishop on C8. Knight to E3 is a splendid idea to go to D5, but it will be more dynamic to attack the bishop as well. After knight to E3, when this game was adjourned, there were various conversations with Anderson to the effect, how is your adjourned position? And he tended to say bad, and people then tended to say to him, of course it's not bad, it's only because you're playing Karpov. And actually he was a little worse if knight B6 happened. But after knight E3 he's okay. His pawns are not very mobile, and the white F pawn is quite cramping, but of course the white F pawn is also quite weak. And what in fact occurred is that after knight E3, knight to D4, rook to G6, black queen to D8, rook to G5, a repetition occurred. The white f-pawn is just weak enough for black to be able to kick the white rook backwards and forwards. And this is what happened. Knight to h7. Rook to h5. Excuse me, after knight to h7, the first time white played rook to g7. 45, rook to g7, and black went back knight to f6, threatening knight to h5. Then rook to g5 happened again. And this time after 46, knight to h7, white played rook to h5, knight to f6, to h6, knight to g8. Again attacking the rook. As you can see, Anderson wouldn't object to a draw too much, and quite right too. And the game, in fact, concluded rook to h5, draw. So Karpov was unable to break down Anderson's defences in this game. In fact, I'm going to show you several games from the Sweden-USSR match because they were rather interesting, and I think it would be sensible to go in descending board order. So my next game is the game between Carlsen and Tal on board 2. Carlsen is a player who was in obscurity a couple of years ago, maybe even a year ago. But just recently, I believe he got a new GM norm. This is very difficult. It requires an extremely strong player to do this. And he isn't bad at all. Now, as white against Tal, Carlsen has played somewhat passively. So please turn to diagram 3 and set the pieces up. This is what we're going to be working from now. So, we're in diagram 3, and Carlsen has played rather passively to reach a position where he isn't enormously worse, but he's certainly not better. He is working towards what I would call a hedgehog reversed. In game 5, we'll see Kasparov defending a hedgehog as black, and diagram 5, in fact, is an excellent example of a hedgehog position, with black's pieces all in the back 3 ranks and cooperating rather well. This is more or less what Carlsen has set up, but he still has to get in e3 and keep his d-pawn alive. And, well, he's probably not worse, but he's certainly not better. He's been extremely passive as white. And here he played the interesting move e3. And the point of this move is that he'd like to play queen to c2 and get his queen into play. But first, he needs to defend against the possibility of knight d4. If he can now play something like queen c2, rook e to d1, then he'll have a perfectly acceptable game. But his d-pawn is weak, and Tal played knight to c7 to put pressure on it. And the game continued bishop f1, bishop f5, which is putting more pressure on it, and then knight to e4. Here, for instance, b6 would be perfectly playable, I'm sure, for black. But Tal tried something a bit more ambitious. He played bishop to g4 with a nasty pin against f3. And if knight takes c5, question mark, bishop takes c5, rook takes c5, e4, and I would then take that position as splat. I think that would be a sensible annotation. So, Carlsen instead played h3, bishop takes h3, and now interpolated knight takes c5. It's a good thing to do. If he took on h3 first, then this move wouldn't attack a queen. Bishop takes c5 from black, bishop takes h3, queen takes h3, rook takes c5. So Carlsen has succeeded in a positional aim of exchanging off his h-pawn for his opponent's c-pawn. However, his king's a little exposed. Now, Tal has certainly got a reasonable position here, but he now embarks on a combination which doesn't work. Now, precisely why he did this, I don't know, but I have been told that he missed something simple. I mean, a player who can calculate very well indeed sometimes makes simple mistakes at the beginning of variations. This is certainly known to occur. But although Tal can calculate incredibly quickly, he can calculate a variation of 10 moves, maybe, I don't know, in as many seconds or less. You just see the pieces moving. Nevertheless, you may make mistakes. And this is what occurred here. He played e4. And of course, if he didn't do that, he'd certainly be quite okay. knight to d4, knight to e5, d takes e4, knight to e6. And around now he's really burnt his bridges, and he's decided to play this combination, which looks impressive, but it just doesn't work really. Rook takes c8, rook takes c8. And here white plays knight takes e6, and Tal lapses into thought. Now this was on the demonstration board in the hall where you're playing, and various people wandered up and looked at it, and thought, is Tal going to sacrifice, and does it work? And the general opinion was, he was going to sacrifice, and it didn't work. In fact, Tal succeeded in getting slightly more than we'd expected, but nevertheless it isn't sound. He played knight to g4, and white played a move which I'm told Tal had missed. I mean, he'd seen an enormously long variation, but he hadn't seen that move. And the move he hadn't seen was queen to d2. And after queen to d2, of course, if queen to f3, then black could play queen to h2 as check, king to f1, rook to c2, for instance. Is that the best after queen f3? Maybe you should play rook to c2 immediately, after which, you just play rook c2 immediately after queen f3. And then if queen to g2, queen takes queen to check, queen takes queen, rook takes bishop. And if rook to e2, rook takes rook, queen takes rook, queen to h2 is check, king to f1, queen to h1 mate. So queen to f3 lost, but queen to d2 is good for white. After queen to d2, Tal thought a long time and came up with a way to do something. He played queen to h2 as check, king to f1, queen to h1 was check, king to e2, queen takes e4, attacking the knight and threatening rook to c2. And after knight to d4, he played queen to g2. And this is an extremely nasty move. Because after the fourth move, rook f1, black has the very nasty coup, rook to e8. And this threatens rook takes e3 with check, which is a particularly vile thing to threaten. It also threatens knight takes e3, which is actually even stronger. So, yes, because initially one would have expected black to play something like knight to h2 instead of rook to e8, and this would just do nothing. But by rook to e8, he wins the exchange back, though he still remains with a lost position, because white must keep his queen defending the rook, keep his king defending the rook and f1, and he is unable to both defend the e-pawn and keep his king defending the rook and allow his rook to move, all three things at the same time. You'll see what I mean. He played knight to c2, and then knight to h2 happened. And this attacks the rook. Should the rook move, then black will have perpetual check. For instance, if rook to d1 is sensible, because if then knight to g4, then queen to d5 check would win outright. If rook to d1, queen to f3 check. Now, if king to e1, black has at least queen to h1 with check with perpetual, probably at most as well. And if king to d3, then black can play queen to f5 check, after which king to e2 would seem to be sensible to me. And then, queen to g4 with check is nasty. What is happening is that black has a raging attack and will have at least perpetual. So white correctly played queen to d1. And unfortunately for Tal, he now has nothing better than to take the rook. For instance, if queen to f3 was check, king to d2, and white threatens nothing, because black threatens nothing, because white can put many pieces in the way in the d file, notably two of them, the bishop and the knight. So, knight takes f1, queen takes f1, and Carsten's cool defence has won the day. He has more material than Tal, and he now won, showing that he is a good player. I mean, if you weren't a good player, a player who wasn't so good might reach this position and still panic, but Carsten won very effectively. The game concluded queen e4, knight to d4, h5, white played king to d2, rook to e5, queen to c4 check, rook to d5, and then king to h2 again. White's just moving his pieces around, improving the position of his pieces. His queen was in f1 a moment ago, and his knight in c2, and now they're starting to get to good squares. King to e2, underpins the knight. King to h7, f3. Yes, incidentally, if f3 the move before, then queen takes f3 was possible, because of the pin and the knight, and now it isn't, of course. Queen to e5, queen to c2 is check, and Tal played f5, and, well, his position's just lost, in fact. f4, queen to f6, knight to f3, queen to a6 was check, queen to c4, and black resigned at adjournment because he's completely lost. You may not think that the advantage of bishop and knight against rook is very great, but in fact it's quite enough in a position like this. So that was Tal losing, playing uncharacteristically badly. In fact, Tal, after his magnificent result in the Riga Interzonal, where he stopped the opposition, notably the 4 other Russians in a row, he hasn't played quite so well. He played in the Russian Championship, and I think he came near the bottom, and here he wasn't so terrifying. On board 3 of the match between the Soviet Union and Sweden, the ex-world champion Petrosian was white against Schneider, and in fact this game was drawn. Now I'm telling you that not because I'm going to show you the game, but because just to show you how strong the Russians are. Their team for this match went Karpov, Tal, Petrosian, Polugaevsky. And they left out together, I think, and had Romanishin on 5. And his ELO rating is only about 2590, maybe 2600. I apologise to him. So anyway, they're pretty strong. Anyway, I'm going to show you the game between Schussler and Polugaevsky, and please turn to diagram 4 to see the position I'm starting from. So, in this position, Polugaevsky as black has got a very reasonable game. White has a passed c-pawn, but his d-pawn is weak, and black has a nice compact position. And here, White played what he thought, I suppose, was a combination, but it wasn't. Knight takes e4, d takes e4, and now, if he played queen takes e4, then knight takes d forward, is extremely unpleasant for him. So he tried instead bishop to c3. This may look clever, but, well, and Polugaevsky gave up his queen now. The 3 pieces, starting with pawn takes f3, bishop takes a5, pawn takes e2, queen takes e2, knight takes a5. So black has got 3 minor pieces for a queen, and if he can coordinate his pieces, he's going to be winning. But this isn't so easy. You always have to be very careful in a position like this. But what we're going to do now is to watch how Polugaevsky coordinates his pieces with really consummate ease, showing just how strong a player he is, and completely kills Schussler. So the game continues. Queen to d2, knight to b3, that's a good move. If it went back to c6, it wouldn't be so active. Here it can be supported, and black starts to centralise. Queen to f4, bishop to d5. White played 23 c6, and now if bishop takes c6 would slightly discoordinate the black pieces, and white could, for instance, play queen to c7, and then pick off the a-pawn, and a passed pawn with queen on the board against blocked pieces can be very dangerous. Polugaevsky played something better. He played rook f to c8, keeping everything together. And rook to d3 happened, rook to b6. Note just how all black's pieces are on good squares, and everything's defended. He's playing it very nicely. And now white played c7 and bishop to f8, and this is really to avoid any tactics which involve checks in the back rank. It also threatens bishop to b6 and just to munch the c7 pawn. So, next h4, and now a little tactic, knight takes d4. because if rook takes b6, there's knight to e2 check. And after king h2, knight takes f4. Of course, with the bishop on g7, that didn't work, because if you'd played knight takes b4 immediately instead of bishop to f8, then after rook takes b6, knight e2 check, king h2, knight takes the queen in f4, rook to b8, an accident has befallen black. So bishop to f8 was very useful, and knight takes b4 wins yet another pawn. White played rook to e1, knight to f5, h5, rook to c6, and really at this point the game is over. Black's coordinated, he's just taken off white's position, and I'll give you the last few moves rather quickly. You must realise, I imagine Schuster was in time trouble, this position just a mess. The game ended, g4, knight to e7, h6, black, rook 6 takes c7, queen to e5, knight to c6, queen to f4, knight to e7. I guess that Polugaevsky must have been time trouble as well, so he's repeating moves. Queen to e5, rook to c4, f3, rook 8 to c7, king to f2, he finally munched the pawn at h6, there was no hurry to take it before. Rook to b1, bishop to g7, queen to h2, that wasn't a very good move. Rook to c2 check, and white resigns since he hasn't got very many pieces left after his queen drops off. So Polugaevsky won 3 pieces for a queen, and then played very well. Was it queen and pawn? It was queen and pawn to start with, wasn't it? And then he just completely crushed his black. Rather an impressive game. Now, on board 8 of the USSR Sweden, I'm still staying with this, the player from the Soviet Union is young Garry Kasparov, and he is widely tipped as the next world champion, I guess. He's a very strong player indeed. The Russians have quite a good policy in this respect, that they tend to protect their very strong young players from losing when they first go into the public eye. So Kasparov, who in fact I discounted it tonight, I think, he was the 7th or 8th highest rated player in the tournament, and his ELO rating is a bit overrated because he had a very fine result at the tournament in Yugoslavia, but it's 25.95. He was playing on board 10 for the Soviet Union. That's the second reserve, though in fact he played in 6 games out of the 7 and scored 5.5 out of 6. Not as good as Karpov's 5 out of 5 in Moscow, but not at all bad. So the game I'm going to show you is what he did to Renman of Sweden, and what he did was to reach a reasonable position, and then he killed him. He just completely massacred him. So if you set up your board, please, then we'll start. Renman of Sweden was white. Now, he's not a player I've heard of before, but he's a perfectly good player. I see his ELO rating. So I keep on reiterating these things, because although they're not necessarily enormously accurate, they do give you an impression of how strong people are. And his ELO rating is, 24, 25, which means that he has known the moves for some considerable time, in all likelihood. So he was white, and it went knight to f3, knight to f6, c4, c5, g3, b6, bishop to g2, bishop to b7, castles, e6, d4, c takes d4, and now the current fashion is to play queen takes d4. If one plays knight takes d4, then white gets a reasonable position, but nothing very special. Queen takes d4 is slightly more combative. So queen takes d4, bishop to e7, knight to c3, d6, rook to d1, a6, b3, knight b to d7, bishop to b2, castles. Now, black is setting up what I call a hedgehog, and most of the English players do, I think. Now, in the game between Carlsen and Tal, If you look at diagram 3, you'll see that white was trying to set up a position rather like the one that black has here, and I referred you to this game. In fact, there are a lot of move order problems in reaching this position, which I can't remember, and I noticed that Kasparov played, well, after queen takes d4, he played bishop e7, then d6, then a6, then knight bishop d7, and so on. And no doubt there is an enormous amount of accuracy involved in this, because sometimes white can play bishop a3 at a nasty moment and cause black unpleasantness. And I didn't worry about that, and I'm not going to, because it's too complicated and confusing. Suffice it to say that black is trying to reach this position, and he's slightly passive. He's on his black 3 ranks, but he has no obvious weaknesses, if he has any weaknesses at all, and he can maneuver, trying to get in the breaks, one of the 2 breaks, d5 or b5, or indeed both. So, white played 12h3, which isn't stupid, it's quite a sensible move. Queen to c7, e4, and here Kasparov played rook a to d8. I think I'd normally play rook a to c8, but I'm sure he knows what he's doing in these positions. Rook a to c1, rook f2, e8, and white played knight to h2, and this knight is going on a journey to e3. What white's best plan is in this position, I don't know. What they used to do was to play queen e3 and then knight to d4. And, well, this was held to be a good place for the knight in d4, and then you could try to build up a kingside attack with f4, but you're always frightened that black will play e5 and win your e-pawn. And these positions are a great test of nerves, because neither side has an obvious plan, and they tend to play a cat-and-mouse game in which usually the stronger player takes on the role of the cat, and this certainly happens with Mr. Kasparov here. So white played knight h2, at least he's got a plan. Other plan would, as I said, be to play queen e3 and knight d4. Finally, he can play knight to d2, and that's where it protects the e-pawn, and that's supposed to be a good idea as well. I mean, I don't know what the best plan is here. Bishop to f8 after knight h2, knight to f1, queen to b8. White played king to h1, and white always agonises over which the best square is for his king, and quite often gets it wrong. So he played king to h1 here, because perhaps he's thinking of playing f4 in a moment. Knight to c5. Now, that's got a little bit of pressure on the e-pawn, so white sensibly played rook e1, and black played queen to a8, and the pressure is more pressure on the e-pawn, and here Renman made a decision which is perhaps wrong. The point is that every move you have to make a decision whether to do something or to do nothing. This is extremely tiring. It's much easier if you know you have to do something. It may be very hard to discover what the right thing to do is, but at least you know. And here it's just very uncertain. Renman played b4. Maybe that's wrong. Knight c to d7, a3. That's very sensible to protect the b-pawn. Rook to c8. Now white's played b4. Unfortunately, this has made his c-pawn a little bit weak. And his position must be okay, but it's a bit uncomfortable, perhaps. Knight to e3, I think. Yes, knight to e3. And now Kasparov's rook on e8 goes to d8, so he's changed his formation of rooks. But note that really, black has done almost nothing in the last few moves, apart from shifting his queen backwards and forwards and his rooks backwards and forwards, and his bishop's gone to the good square f8. Here, white played king to h2, and black played queen to b8. And now Renman played king to h1. We've now reached the position in diagram 5, and it is black to move. And I suggest you look and see what black's best move is in this position, and it's a very good one too. So I'm afraid that after this manoeuvring phase, an accident befell Mr. Renman, because knight to c5 happened. A move which could again be annotated with splat. And this move is quite incredibly strong. If pawn takes c5, b takes c5, d takes c5, white's queen is trapped. And unfortunately this means that black's won a pawn. Very unlucky. Knight b3 is threatened. If rook to d1, rook c to d1, then black can play e5 and knight takes e4 and win a pawn. I mean, the position is actually already completely lost for white. So that's what manoeuvring does for you, if you're Kasparov. So white played, eventually, rook to c2. And after e5, he lost his pawn. Queen to d1. Knight c takes e4. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Knight takes e4. Queen to f3. Knight to f6. Black's now a clear pawn up. His position might look a tiny bit ragged, but it's perfectly sound, and he consolidated his position, and in fact the game was adjourned, but white resigned without resuming. At the European Team Championship, there were an enormous number of good players. There always are at these tournaments. Now, I'm not able, of course, to show you games by all of them, because I just haven't got space in this cassette. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a very good game by another of the players who qualified for the candidates, and this is Portish. He played a game in round 3 as black against Ermenkov, which was very good, very thematic. So, Ermenkov is white. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, and Najdorf. And Ermenkov rather unwisely chose to play bishop to c4 here, which is a system that Fischer used to play a long time ago, but it's not especially well thought of nowadays. e6, and now there is an enormous amount of theory stemming from bishop to b3, b5, but instead Ermenkov played a3, which is quite an unusual move. Now, if I remember, then if black now plays b5, and after bishop to a2, white has gained something. Now, what is the advantage of this? After b5, bishop a2, then black can't play b4, of course, because of a3. And if then bishop to b7, then I think a bishop takes e6 sacrifice becomes good quite soon. That's what tends to happen in Najdorf if the bishop moves too early. And after b5, bishop to a2, bishop to e7, maybe white has a good move. I wonder what. Anyway, I'm not going to bother with this. The point is that bishop e7 is a good, strong move, and very sensible, and Portish played this. And I think that after bishop to e7, a3 is a bit silly. Ermenkov now played bishop to a2, justifying his last move, but he has wasted a tempo. Castles, and now f4, b5, black's starting to get play, f5, e5, knight d to e2. Well, white's given black a slightly weak square on d5, but at the cost of development a little, and, well, his pieces aren't so well coordinated. And bishop to b7 happens, knight to g3, knight b to d7, and white played bishop to g5. I'm not going to vouch for that move either. That may or may not be good. Rook to c8. And now white castles. And this leads to diagram 6. So look at this position, please, and find out what black ought to play here. Black played a thematic exchange sacrifice. Nothing tactical, just a very good move. Rook takes c3. B takes c3, knight takes e4. And for the exchange, he's got a pawn. He's made rather a mess of white's pawns on the queen side. I just managed to avoid using expletive about them. And he's just got a very good position indeed. And after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, it's quite clear that black has got more than enough for the exchange. White's pieces just look very silly. White played c4. I don't know what he should be considering doing. Maybe bishop to d5 to get rid of his bishop. That was quite sensible to me. c4 looks a bit... don't like it. Rook to c8, queen to e2, knight to f6. And so white succeeds in winning a pawn, but black's pieces are very well coordinated, and this isn't going to help him very much. Well, actually, he played rook a to c1 here, and now he couldn't take on b5 immediately because of rook takes c2. And now black played h5, and after c takes b5, a takes b5, queen takes b5, white had won a pawn back, but at the cost of discoordinating his pieces. And black played queen to a7 check, king to h1, h4. Now, after the exchange sacrifice, white's position was a bit of a mess. Just look at it now; it's horrible. Black has this huge centre, controls all the centre. His bishop and e4 is, well, breathes fire, I feel, and he's assaulting white's king rather vigorously. And white is in really quite a mess. He went queen to b3. I think this was round 3. Yes, I wasn't playing on this day because, as you'll see at the end of this cassette, I had a very long adjournment with Velikov in the morning, and I wandered around and saw various games, and this was a game which particularly impressed me. It looked rather lovely for black. And knight to g4 happened, threatening to go knight e3. h3, there was also, h3 might have, sorry, knight f2 check was threatened as well in that position, wasn't it? Yes. Yes, so it's pointed out to me that after knight f2 check, rook takes, queen takes f7 check is a draw at the moment. But his black was threatening h3, queen takes h3, knight f2 check, winning the exchange, or just simply knight e3. He has a very good position. After h3, then of course knight f2 check would be silly, because if rook takes f2 and white has at least a draw. But knight e3 is a good, strong, natural move. And rook to g1 to defend his g-pawn, knight takes f5. That's just peeling white's position off. You realize I'm not giving you enormous amounts of analysis of this position, because partly it isn't, the exchange sacrifice wasn't analytical. Believe it or not, Portish didn't visualize this position when he played rook takes c3. He saw that he had a good position, that he had at least enough for the exchange, and that white just wasn't coordinated enough. And this is precisely what's happening. King to h2 from white, and d5, that's a nice move, that blocks out the irritating diagonal. c4, and about now, I assume that Portish had been calculating concretely, but now he could find a forced win. And I'm going to go a little way and then ask you to find out the rest. Rook to b8, queen to c3, queen to f2. Queen takes e5, and now the rook is on prise, and so rook to b2. Now c takes d5. Now, black could play rook takes a2. No, he couldn't, because the queen takes e4. Excuse me. But black has an extremely strong move. So it's black to play in this position, and I suggest you look and see what black should play here. Well, black played 31, queen takes g2 check. Rook takes g2, rook takes g2 check, king to h1, knight to g3 with check, and Menkov resigned, because after queen takes g3, well, black could play rook takes g3 with check, king to h2, rook to g2 with check, and then lop off a rook or a bishop or something. He could also play h takes g3, and then rook to h2 double check and rook to h1 with mate in a moment. In any case, he has several ways of winning. I'm sure he would have found one of them. So that was just a thematic game, and it's very impressive that Portish can play against quite a strong grandmaster, Menkov, a game as simple as that. It's easy to play impressive games against people you're much stronger than, but not against people of your own strength. And it's impressive that Portish is stronger than Menkov to the extent that he can play a simple game against him. Right. After England's good result in round 1 with a draw against the Soviet Union, we didn't do particularly well, in fact, until we played the Yugoslavs in round 5. I think before this match that people had predicted the result would be something like 5.5, 2.5 to them. But in fact, we got 6-2 to us, which is rather incredible, really. So I'm going to have quite a lot of games from that match now on this cassette. This was really decisive from England's point of view. Well, it's completely decisive. So I'm going to start with the game on board 1 between Ljubojevic and Miles. Miles tends to play well against Ljubojevic. If you turn to diagram 7, please, you'll see a position in the middle game. So, this position arose from a dragon, in fact, but more like a knight horse. It was 11 fish against the dragon. That's white plays f4, 6f4, I think 6f4, and this transposed to something which looks very like an f4 against a knight horse. Anyway, it's just a sensible Sicilian position. Here white decided to checkmate black. I'm not sure if that's a mistake or not. By playing f takes e5, d takes e5, knight to g5. And, well, this is very dangerous. And if h6, then rook takes f6 is extremely strong. So Miles went back with knight and c5 to d7, protecting his knight. Well, I think positionally it's certainly a gain for black that white has taken an e5. Something that black wanted him to do. Just depends whether tactically he gets mated or not. In fact, he doesn't. He's got a very solid defence with almost all his pieces defending his king side. Of course, for instance, the bishop in b7 controls d5, which is a good thing. Here Ljubojevic played rook to f3, continuing the same vein, and Miles started to repel him with h6, knight to h3, knight to h5. And here Ljubojevic decided that he ought to get on with it still, so he played g4, knight to f4. Here black is forced to sacrifice a pawn. If he went knight to f6, then he'd also lose a pawn, but rather a more important one. So knight takes f4. Of course, with the knight, your black square bishop is rather important. Pawn takes f4, bishop takes f4, knight to e5. And in this position, black has ample compensation for his pawn in the shape of a good square for his knight in e5 and his two very good bishops. His bishops are both better than white's, and white's e-pawn is weak. He's got a fine position. Here, Ljubojevic played an extremely strange move, I find rather amazing. He played rook to h3. I find incredible. Well, there we are. Very strange move. And Miles played g5. And if this gets taken, bishop takes, then black has what? Knight to g6 perhaps, and then queen h5. Can we cause an accident somehow? Yes, in this position, black has the rather strong move rook e5, which wins at least a bishop, or white's queen's a bit embarrassed as well. He might lose his queen as well. Anyway, so this takes g5, just loses outright to knight to g6, so he has to take the knight, which is a little unfortunate. Presumably he didn't see that when he played rook h3. And after bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, black certainly has enough for a pawn now. This is the black squares. Queen to g3, queen to c5. This is a beautiful position for black, but of course he has to be careful. I believe Ljubojevic is quite renowned for getting ugly positions like this and then grovelling around and eventually surviving, and then winning the ending a pawn up. Well, he doesn't do this in this game at all, as you will see. Queen to g1, queen to b4, rook to b1, and now black played an excellent move, mobilising the rest of his pieces. Can you see it? Well, he played f5, exploiting the pin on the diagonal. Extremely strong move. G takes f5, rook e takes f5, and all black's pieces are in play. And if, for instance, knight to d5, black just plays rook takes d5, retaining his bishop. Pawn takes d5, bishop takes d5 with check, and that wins queen? Yeah, at least a queen. It's quite strong anyway. So, white played queen e1, queen c5, rook e3. He's still grovelling around. Rook f2, rook g3, I don't think I should try to explain these moves, because I'm sure Lubovitch wasn't quite certain what he was doing, except that he was grovelling. Bishop to d4. And here white played knight to d5. And if bishop takes d5, then black will win his pawn back but give white relief. Of course, black doesn't want to do that. He plays a much stronger move, queen to d6. Now, Miles is threatening something quite catastrophic. Can you see what it is? Well, Miles is threatening rook takes h2 as check, king takes h2, bishop to f2. That would be quite a catastrophe. It would just be a total disaster. And so white prevented this with knight to e3, repositioning the knight. And Miles played queen to g6, attacking the e-pawn, knight to g2, and then queen to h5. And bishop e5 must be a bit of a threat by now. You can see that the extra pawn isn't playing a great role in this position. White played queen to d1, and here black finally completely destroyed white's position, starting with queen takes d1 with check, rook takes d1. Well, what was black's next move? It was extremely thematic. Well, black played bishop takes e4, which is rather a nice move. And if bishop takes e4, rook to f1 with check causes mate to occur. And white had nothing better than h4, bishop to e5. By the way, both players were in time trouble now. As you might have guessed, Lubovitch wasn't finding it easy to play his moves quickly, and Miles was making very certain that he didn't make a mistake. And, well, the game finished. Bishop takes e4, bishop takes g3, knight to e3, rook to h2 as check, king to g1, rook takes h4, bishop to d5 check, king to g7, king to g2, bishop to f2, and here the game was adjourned, and of course Lubovitch resigned without resuming. He's the exchange and a pawn down, and he has absolutely nothing for this. He's completely lost. So that was an impressive win by Miles against Lubovitch. In the introduction, I stated that England only won 2 games as white, the English players, and both of these were in fact won by Jonathan Mestel. He started with a loss to Bahanian in the first round, but after that he won 2 games as white. No, he won 3 games in total, and then in the last round he lost, unfortunately. So, this is one of his 2 wins as white. Please turn to diagram 8. This is the game Mestel-Nemeth. This started as a Sicilian Najdorf with bishop e2, e5 happening. Black played rather inaccurately and allowed white to play knight to d5, and then black had to take and white retook with his d-pawn. And then white played well and got in the move c4, so at the moment he has a space advantage on the queen side. Now, in this position, Nemeth became rather concerned because white has a very simple long-term plan of b4 and then maybe knight b3, followed by c5, after which he'd be doing extremely well. And so Nemeth decided to eliminate some of the queen side with the rather dubious move b6. Mestel found a good reply here. He played knight to c6. So if now knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, queen takes c6, and bishop to f3 wins the exchange. And if knight takes, pawn takes, something like knight to b8, then black is very disorganized. White can do nasty things to him while he's trying to win the pawn. Nemeth played instead knight to c5, but he completely missed Mestel's intention. Knight to c5 threatens to win the exchange, but unfortunately something happens first. Mestel played bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and then b4, which is an enormously strong move. And Nemeth thought sometime and played knight to b3, queen to e3. And now, well, black could try knight to d4, but it's not at all nice. He's got a very bad position. He played knight takes c1, and then the interpolation. A takes b6 happens, which is extremely strong. And after queen to d7, rook takes c1. White has a horde of pawns seldom seen before, and this horde won the game for him, as you will see. e4, rook to d1. Now black has no way of stopping these pawns from advancing, so what he does is to try to create counterplay on the other side of the board. That's his only chance. He has got a 4-2 kingside majority. It's just unlucky that he has a 4-1 queenside minority, and that the 4 against him are rampant. h5. This is to prepare bishop h6 in a moment. c5, king to h7, knight to a5. But he's been very methodical. He's just getting ready to push those pawns, and when they roll, they'll roll. And bishop to h6. Black's managed to remove the blockader from the e-pawn, but it's taken a long time. Queen to b3, bishop to f4, d6, e3. Now here, Mestel could have won very efficiently with the simple move rook f1. Now, he was a bit nervous here. I think he was getting near time trouble, and he wanted to find a way to win for certain. In fact, after rook f1, queen f5, g3, I think after queen e4 check, he didn't notice king g1 possibly. Anyway, there was some confusion about the most efficient way to do it. He just found a way to win a rook for these 3 pawns, which is a reasonable return, not a very good one considering where they are. He played b7, rook a to d8, c6, queen to f5, c7. And you'll observe that these pawns have advanced quite a long way, and rook takes d6 happens. Rook takes d6, bishop takes d6, c8 equals queen, rook takes c8, b7 takes c8 equals queen, queen takes c8, queen takes f7 with check, king to h6, and now White played knight to c4, bishop takes b4. And here there was about a quarter of an hour left to the end of the session, and to be careful, because although White's pawn up, he hasn't got many pawns left, Mestel sealed queen to f4 check. No, he didn't, I'm sorry. He played queen to f4 with check. King to g7, queen takes e3, a5, and now he's sealed queen to e5 check. And this position is won. It isn't quite as simple as one might have guessed, but it definitely is winning. And after resumption, it went on for some time, but he won it quite effectively. That took about another 30 moves, actually. Black resisted sternly. So that was one of our 2 wins as White. On board 5, Raymond Keane had a quiet start. He drew several games as White, but then he suddenly burst out and won a couple of very violent games as Black. In the Yugoslavia match, he did horrible things to Marjanovic, who's a very strong young grandmaster. So this game started. Please set up the pieces in the initial position. So I'm going to show you all of this one. e4, g6, d4, bishop to g7, knight to c3, d6. So this is a modern defense. f4, White is an attacking player, as you will see. Knight to c6, bishop to e3, knight to f6. Knight to f3, castles, bishop to e2. Now here, Black can do various things, but what Keane does is a rather interesting move, the Miles move as well against Karpov, if you remember. a6, to gain space, to steal some space on the queen side. And whatever its objective strength, this move always puts White into a bit of quandary as to what to do about it. If he plays a4, he's admitted that Black was doing something, and rather ruled out castling queenside. And this is what he did. I don't think a4 was a especially good move. White should probably let Black play b5 and get on with something himself. White played a4, e6, And now e5 is possible here for white. And Keen has said to me that black should play something like knight to d5. And now maybe white can play queen to d2, giving up his black squared bishop. But with the interpolation of a6, a4, then casting queenside will be bad for white. Black could have played e6 instead of a6, but then the move e5 will be quite strong, because in the corresponding position after queen to d2, white can always consider casting queenside. Here it's very hazardous. Anyway, white played h3. We thought the knight to g4 was threatened, and black got on with it with knight to e7. Very provocative, this. In fact, black is playing for c5. It looks as though black's playing passively, but in a minute he will burst out, as you will see. Now, white, a bit confused, now played a good, strong attacking move. Well, rather a bad move, actually. He played g4. I suppose he thought he was attacking black, but it looked a bit hazardous, this. And after b6, he now played rather an odd move, knight to d2. Now, the idea of this move, it seems rather odd to move a piece away from the king side when you're supposed to be attacking there. The idea of this move is to prevent c5, as you will see. However, it doesn't. Keen played c5. D takes c5, b takes c5, knight to c4. This was the point of knight to d2. And d5 is forced. And now white plays the move which he was intended to play. Can you see what white played here? Well, white played bishop takes c5. So that if d takes c4, then queen takes d8, and white's won a pawn. However, black has other ideas and plays the strong move knight to d7, which Marjanovic had either not seen or completely underestimated. And this move really wins the game. White played bishop takes e7, which is forced. Queen takes e7, e takes d5, bishop to b7, and we reach diagram 9. And in diagram 9, white is 2 pawns up, but if you look at his position, it's just a little bit of a wreck. Now, white here played queen to d2. An alternative was castles, but this comes to a rather grisly end. The variation goes castles, and maybe, no, you don't need to move the pieces, I don't think, if you think about the position carefully. But in any case, we're returning to diagram 9 in a moment. Castles. E takes d5. Now, if knight takes d5, queen to c5 with check. Is very strong. So, knight to d2, d4, knight to a2, queen to e3 check, king to h2. And now black has the extremely strong move, bishop to e5. Pawn takes e5, queen takes e5 check, king to g1, queen to g3 mate. I think that's quite grisly, don't you? Alternatively, instead of bishop to e5, black could play a duel. Bishop to h6, certainly bishop takes f4 and mates. G5, bishop takes g5, f takes g5, queen to e5 check. So castles wasn't a good idea in this position. Anyway, white in diagram 9 played queen to d2, and e takes d5 happened, and white clearly has nothing better than knight takes d5. Now Keen could and did seriously consider playing queen h4 with check and just trying to mate white, but instead he found a way to win material, so he played this. He played queen to e4, and white played castles queenside. Now black played bishop takes d5. Now if you wish, I could suggest that you analyse the variation after bishop takes d5, but it's very complicated. You'll find it very difficult to find out precisely what's going on. So if you want to, then spend some time finding out what's going on after bishop takes d5, but otherwise just play through with me. Bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes d2. Now, if queen takes d7, then simply queen takes c4 and black has won a piece. And of course white couldn't do that. Now, Keen thinks that white's best is to play here rook to d2. Black then has knight to f6. And if queen takes a8, queen takes d2 check, so that's one material. But instead, White plays rook to d2, knight to f6, queen takes f7 with check. And after rook takes f7, he's a piece down, but at least he's got 3 pawns for it. Of course, black's better, but white has some drawing chances. Instead, white played what is, I think, a natural move, rook h to e1. I think I'd play it. I wouldn't give up the piece very lightly, even though this variation is very bad. And after rook h to e1, queen to f2, he played queen takes d7, queen takes f4 check. So white's kept equal material, and in fact he's a pawn up, but his position is extremely gory. If knight to e3, knight to e3 was played, I'm sorry. If knight to d2, then just rook a to d8 and bishop to h6 just causes disaster against the d2 square. So he has to play knight to e3. Black plays the good move rook a to b8, threatening b2, and after c3 he played rook f to e8. Now unfortunately, if white now plays rook to d3, then black has a crushing move. Can you see it? Well, if rook to d3, then black plays queen to f2, and that's that, I'm afraid, because b2 is on freeze and so is e1. So white is forced to play queen to d6, in fact, to try to ameliorate the pressure. And this loses the a pawn, queen takes a4. So now white's equal material, and he's still in a total mess. Now, at this stage, white played knight to c2, and black played rook f to c8, which is extremely strong. It's just threatening something like bishop takes c3 or queen to a2. There are lots of possibilities, but clearly white's king is rather exposed, given that there are 4 black pieces attacking it and only the knight defending. White has a choice here, I feel, between resigns, which isn't totally unreasonable, and the move he played, which is g5. Oh yes, bishop to h6 check was going to be a threat quite soon as well, followed by something like rook takes c3. So he played g5, and now unfortunately he loses yet another pawn to queen to b5. b4, queen takes g5 check, king to b1, bishop takes c3, and the game concluded. Rook to d5, queen to g2, rook e to d1, and now rook takes b4 with check would be very strong, but bishop takes b4 is just as strong. Not surprising that a combination, if you wish to call it that, arises when black has all these pieces against white's king. Knight takes b4, queen to c2 check, king to a1, queen to c3 check, king to a2, rook takes b4, and white resigned, not unreasonably. Completely crushing win from king. In order to do well in any event, one needs a certain amount of luck. Now, I was in fact intending, I was going to show you something of my games at this tournament. I was going to show you my game with Sachs, which I lost, which I wish to counterbalance by this game, which I won. However, I haven't got space for both, so I'm afraid I'm ditching Sachs in favour of Velikov, who I beat. Well, that's vanity, I suppose, but there you are. So, this is my game with Velikov. Now, in this game, what happened was that I kept on playing quite a long series of rather good moves, followed by very bad ones, and I kept on getting good positions and then destroying them. And eventually I lost the pawn, but managed to survive to reach this position, with just near the adjournment, in which I'm worse but alive. I lost the pawn, but managed to keep myself together. So, white has just played knight from d2 to e4. There's not enormous time trouble, but a bit. Maybe because the delusion he's threatening knight takes g3. If he takes it, then I retake and take a rook, so he isn't. So I played b5. Now if you play king f1, and after bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, h3, my rooks would burst into action. I'd get a certain amount of counterplay. Whether it would be enough is another matter, but certainly I'd have real chances. So he avoided that, and moved his knight back again. I played bishop to d5. I wasn't sure whether c4 was right, but I felt that, given he'd shown a reluctance to move these pawns, I ought to give him a choice before the adjournment and one to use up time. And in fact, he didn't do c4. He played a very sensible move, rook to g1. This threatens rook takes h4. By the way, he had to protect his f3 point, so bishop takes f3 wouldn't work. That's what the knight's doing on d2. Rook to h6, now rook to h3. And if I take that, then I'm very much worse. e5, he doubled rooks, rook g to h1. Maybe you should have taken e5 and then done that. And then rook takes h3, rook takes h3, and I sealed d4 takes e5 takes d4. And in this position, white is better, but not winning. White played c3 takes d4, and over the adjournment, white is a pawn up, but it's not very serious. However, black's pawns are weak. Black has 4 isolated pawns, and the extra pawn is in b2, where it isn't very good, is it, or in b3 if you wish. And we found that the best move was b4. White plays rook to h1 to centralise his rook, and here I played king to b6. Now white's best move here is rook to e1, and if king to b5, which is part of my plan to protect the b pawn, get my pieces coordinated, he has rook to e8. Then after h3, pawn takes h3, rook takes h3, he has rook to f8. And then I can check his king once, but after that I have to remain a bit passive. I have to defend my f-pawn, and I'm worse. However, white decided quite naturally to centralise his king. Not a good idea. He played king to e2, bishop to f7, king to d3. And this was not a good idea, because now black has a very good move indeed. I wonder if you can see it. Nothing dramatic, just a very strong move. Well, black played d5, and this knight in d2, which did look strong, is becoming a little bit embarrassed in its movements, I fear. He played king to e2, and I played bishop to e8, which is another good move. And king to f2, bishop to b5. Rook to e1, and rook to c6. And now if you look at the position, you'll find that white's knight is absolutely terrible, and black is in fact completely winning. It's very strange how from a position where white was a bit better, just a couple of inaccurate moves can completely destroy the position. White just has no defence against the black rook's entry. He played rook to a1, and black played bishop to d3, which is the accurate move. Now, what black wants to do is to invade when white's pieces are in bad squares, and if rook to c2, king to e1, rook takes b2, then white could stick his rook in a8, which would be a nuisance. But now after bishop to d3, if king to e1, rook to e6 was check, king to d1's forced, rook to g6, and wins. So white has nothing better than rook to d1, and now I played rook to c2 with the white rook in the bad square d1, and after king e1, rook takes b2, and you won the pawn without white getting any real counterplay. Rook to a1, rook to c2. And now, if king to d1, rook to c8, and white is completely lost, because after rook a4, and rook to c1 is also very bad, which we'll see in a moment, so rook to c1 just loses to bishop e2 check. Rook to a4, rook to g8, rook takes b4, check. The black king moves, and white loses his g-pawn, and the black's h-pawn just wins. It's disgusting for white. So he had to play rook to d1 again, and now black gets the a-file, with rook to a2, rook to c1. And, in fact, this position is rather easily winning. White's problem is that if he ever moves his king to d1, then rook to a8 will win, because he can't now play king to e1 because of the check on the e-file, so he has to do something else. And there are no other constructive moves, really. If, for instance, well, there isn't even a rook move up this c-file, so white is reduced to rook from d1 to c1 and back. So here, after his move rook to c1, I found the plan of moving my king to the king side. I played king to b7, rook to d1, king to c6, think c6 rather than c7, no difference. Rook to c1 with check, king to d6. This was 56 moves, the second time control. The Germans will play to a finish, in fact, well, for 4 hours anyway. 32 moves worth. You know the time limit is, as always in international tournaments, 40 moves in 2.5 hours each and 60 moves per hour thereafter. And so we had now 60 moves worth. And after the rook to c1 with check, I went king to d6, rook to d1, king to e6, rook to c1, king to f5, rook to d1. So I decided I'm going to put my king on g5, but I prefer his king to in fact be on d1 than I did so. So I went king to f6, rook to c1, king to g5. Right, we've now reached diagram 11. I suppose it's rather egocentric of me to have 2 diagrams for my game and 1 for every other one, but it does help when analysing this position. Well, here white panicked really and played rook to c5, after which he gets a little bit of active play but is completely lost. And in a minute I'll just give you the end of the game. But the normal move would be rook to d1. Then one could consider playing h3, g takes h3, king to h4. Actually, that's very strong, I think. But what I intended was rook to a6, knight to f1, rook to e6 check, king to d2, bishop to b5. There were some sub-variations, but we'll just take the main line. Now white must play a rook to e1, and one takes an e1. Rook takes e1, king takes e1. And then the best move is h3. G takes h3. Another good move, bishop to d7. Now the reason you do this instead of king h4 is that the knight is going to be kept away from g4, and by doing it this way you prevent it. After king to f2, king to h4, or bishop takes h3, then white is completely helpless. The black king must get to g3 in a moment. For instance, I don't know. Let's think. There aren't really any variations. What happens is that white loses the h3 pawn, and to the king eventually. Black's king gets to h3. Then his bishop gets to d3. So you get the position knight on d2 against bishop on d3 eventually. At that point, white's knight is immobilized, and so he's playing king and pawn ending, in which black's king is far too active, and he just loses. So this position is completely winning for black. And that would be a reason for avoiding playing passively with rook to d1. So in diagram 11, white decided to go active with rook to c5, an understandable decision. And the game concluded. Rook to a1 with check, king to f2, rook to d1, rook takes d5 with check, and knight to e4 check didn't do anything, you just move the king, and the mate is threatened. King to g6, rook to d6 check, king to f7, rook to b6, rook takes d2 check, king to g1. Black's won a piece, white gets a few pawns, but not nearly enough. I'll give you the last few moves very quickly. Bishop to f5, rook takes b4, king to f6, rook to c4, king to g5, b4, h3, g takes h3, king to h4, rook to c7, king to g3, threatening mate, rook to g7 check, king takes f3, b5, bishop to e4, h4, rook to d1 with check, king to h2, 75, king to f2, and white resigned, because rook h1 mate is threatened. After king h3, black shouldn't play rook h1 with check, king g4, rook to g1 with check, because after king takes f4, rook takes g7, king takes e4, white has reasonable chances. I guess it's drawn. But simply bishop to f3, and then mate in a couple of moves. So that was my little bit of luck for the tournament, I think my main piece. And I'm going to finish with one more position in which luck played a role. And this This was Ornstein v Popov from round 5. Ornstein had been pressing for the whole game, but he played a bit inaccurately and gave black counterplay. Please turn to diagram 12. In this position, white played bishop takes a6, and I guess, well, he was trying to win. It was brave of him, but unfortunately it doesn't work. I think they were both in time trouble. Rook to c2 with check, king to h3, rook to h1. White played rook takes f7, and black played h5, threatening mate in 1. And white had prepared the reply g4, which he hoped would be sufficient. And if, for instance, bishop e5, then king h4. Unfortunately, black played rook on h1 takes h2 with check, king to g3, g5. And I don't know if white sealed f4 or not. No, I think he resigned here. And white's intended reply was, of course, f4. Unfortunately, this loses, rather catastrophically. I think you should look and see how it loses. Well, after f4, black has mate in 3, effectively. Rook on c to f2. Pawn takes to h5, g4 takes h5. Rook on h to g2 check. King to h3. g4, checkmate.